All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today we're diving into a topic that's both fascinating and a little bit unsettling. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba.
Yeah, Lumumba's story is one that's kind of shrouded in mystery, a lot of unanswered questions.
Exactly. Was his death just a tragic outcome of the chaos in the newly independent Congo? Or was there something more sinister at play, like, Cold War intrigue and foreign interference?
Well, to understand that, we got to go back to 1960. Think Cold War tensions. A newly independent Congo trying to find its footing, and this charismatic leader, Patrice Lumumba, emerging on the world stage.
Right, and Lumumba wasn't exactly a stranger to struggle. His life before politics was.
Yeah.
Well, let's just say he had a lot of different
Oh,
experiences.
absolutely. I mean, he was born Elias Okita Sambo, heir of the cursed, was the meaning of his original surname. He had jobs like beer salesman, postal clerk.
Wow, heir of the cursed. You
Yeah.
can't make this stuff up.
You can't, but he was always a reader, always learning. He devoured books about Enlightenment ideals, formed his own critiques of colonialism.
So you can see how these experiences, his background, really shaped his political views.
For sure. And those views were reflected in the party he formed, the MNC. They advocated for independence, Africanization, economic development, and this idea of neutrality in foreign affairs.
A neutrality. Was that even possible during the Cold War? It seems like every country was forced to choose a side.
Right. And that's where Lumumba's vision ran into some complications.
Because both the U.S. and the Soviet Union were looking at the Congo, right?
They were. I mean, the Congo was strategically important, rich in resources. It was like this prize in the Cold War chess match.
And Lumumba, by insisting on neutrality, was kind of messing up their game.
Exactly. And then you have this pivotal moment, June 30th, 1960, Congo's Independence Day. Lumumba gives this incredibly powerful speech.
I've read about that speech. It was pretty bold, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. It was celebrated within the Congo, of course, but it caused a lot of anxiety in the West.
Because of how he talked about independence. Wasn't it something like independence wasn't a gift from Belgium, it was won through struggle and sacrifice?
Yeah, and in the context of the Cold War, those words, struggle and sacrifice, well, they sounded a little too close to communist rhetoric for comfort.
Ah, I see. So even as the Congo is celebrating this momentous occasion, the seeds of suspicion are already being planted.
Exactly. And things, unfortunately, spiral pretty quickly from there.
Because of the forced public mutiny, right?
Right. The force public, even after independence, was still largely controlled by Belgian officers, so you had the simmering resentment among the Congolese soldiers.
They fought for independence, but were still taking orders from their former colonizers.
It was a recipe for disaster, and it boiled over very quickly.
So how does Lumumba handle this crisis?
He's in a tough spot. He tries to appease the mutineers, promotes Congolese soldiers, even appeals to the UN for help to stabilize the situation.
But that just makes things worse, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Especially with Belgium.
Oh, yeah. Belgium wasn't too happy about Lumumba asserting Congolese independence. They feared losing their influence in the region, especially with all the valuable resources there.
And this is where the Katanga secession comes into the picture.
Right. Katanga, a mineral-rich province in the south, declares independence with a lot of support from Belgium.
Of course they did.
It throws everything into chaos. A newly independent nation trying to hold itself together, a secessionist movement backed by a former colonial power. It was a very tense situation.
So Lumumba is caught in the middle of all this, trying to lead a country in turmoil, dealing with external pressures.
And all the while, the Cold War is looming over everything. Every move he makes is analyzed, scrutinized, looking for any hint of communist leanings.
It almost feels like a tragedy waiting to happen. And knowing what happens next, it's hard not to see it that way.
Yeah, things are about to get a lot more complicated and a lot more dangerous for Lumumba.
Okay, so before we go there, why didn't Lumumba just side with the West? It seems like that would have made his life a lot easier.
Well, that's a good question. And to understand that, you have to really grasp Lumumba's vision. He was deeply committed to a truly independent Congo, free from any kind of foreign control.
He didn't want to trade one master for another.
Exactly. He saw aligning with either side in the Cold War as a betrayal of that vision.
So he's determined to chart his own course, even if it means making powerful enemies.
And as we'll see, that determination ultimately puts him in a very precarious position.
A position that, sadly, he wouldn't escape from. All right, we'll be back after a quick break to continue our deep dive into the assassination of Patrice Lumumba.
It was like he was caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, and internally, the political situation in the Congo was pretty volatile too, wasn't it? You mentioned President Kasavubu before the break. He and Lumumba, didn't they start out as allies?
Yeah, initially they were on the same side, but they had different ideas about how the Congo should be governed. Kasavubu was more in favor of a federalist structure, kind of like a more decentralized government.
And Lumumba?
Lumumba, he was all about a strong, unified Congo. He saw federalism as a threat, especially with Katanga trying to break away. He thought it would just lead to more division and instability.
Okay, so that's where the conflict starts brewing. Their visions for the Congo are clashing.
Right, and it all kind of explodes in September 1960. Kasavubu announces that he's dismissing Lumumba from his position as prime minister.
Whoa, hold on. Could he even do that? Just dismiss the prime minister like that?
It was a really controversial move. A lot of people questioned whether he actually had the authority to do that, but Lumumba wasn't just going to sit back and take it.
So what did he do?
He fought back, accused Kasavubu of treason, and basically declared him deposed in return.
Oh, wow. So now you have these two rival leaders both claiming to be the legitimate head of state. What a mess.
It was total chaos. And the UN, even though they were already there, were kind of hesitant to get directly involved. They didn't want to be seen as taking sides.
Right. It's a delicate situation. They're trying to maintain peace, but also respect the Congo's sovereignty. So what happens next?
Well, the Congolese parliament steps in. They say, hey, you're both out of line. They basically nullify both Kasavubu's dismissal of Lumumba and Lumumba's counter-declaration. Talk about a political stalemate.
So everyone's back to square one. And this is where Mobutu comes in.
Yep. Colonel Joseph Mobutu, he was the army chief of staff, the head of the military.
Wasn't he appointed by Lumumba himself?
He was, just a few weeks before all this went down. And now Mobutu sees his opportunity. He steps in and stages what he called a peaceful revolution.
Peaceful. It sounds more like a coup.
Yeah, in reality, it was a coup. He neutralizes Lumumba, Kasavubu, and the parliament. He's basically the one calling the shots now.
So Mobutu's basically running the show at this point. And what happens to Lumumba?
He's placed under house arrest, guarded by UN troops, believe it or not.
Wait, so the UN is guarding the guy who's just been ousted from power?
Yeah, it's a pretty bizarre situation. They were trying to prevent further violence, I guess.
Yeah.
But Lumumba, being Lumumba, he wasn't just going to sit around and wait.
He tries to escape, right?
He does. He tries to make his way to Stanleyville, where his supporters had set up a rival government.
So he's still trying to regain control.
He was. But his escape attempt fails. He's captured en route by Mobutu's forces and brought back to Leopoldville. And that's when things take a really dark turn.
Because now the question isn't just about Congolese politics anymore, right?
It's not. The question becomes, was Lumumba's death just a result of this internal power struggle, or was there something more going on, something more sinister, maybe involving foreign powers?
The question of assassination is starting to loom large, isn't it?
It is. And the events that unfold next only make those questions more urgent.
So what happens after Lumumba is recaptured? What's his fate?
Well, Mobutu makes a decision that's going to have huge consequences. Instead of putting Lumumba on trial in Leopoldville, he decides to transfer him to Katanga.
Katanga, the province that had seceded. The one led by Muzi Chon.
The one and only. And remember, Chon was heavily backed by Belgium, the very same Belgium that Lumumba had denounced in his independence speech.
Sending Lumumba to Katanga, that sounds like a really bad idea.
It was. It was basically a death sentence. There were already rumors and whispers of plans to get rid of Lumumba permanently, and some of those plans involved foreign powers who saw him as a threat.
Okay, so you're saying there were actual assassination plots against Lumumba?
There were. Declassified documents showed that both the Belgian government and the CIA were discussing the possibility of eliminating Lumumba.
Wow. They saw him as that much of a danger.
They did. They viewed him as a potential communist, a destabilizing force, someone who needed to be taken out of the equation.
So Lumumba is sent to Katanga, basically right into the lion's den. What happens to him there?
He's imprisoned, he's beaten, he's tortured, and on January 17th, 1961, he's executed by a firing squad, along with two of his close allies, Maurice Mapolo and Joseph Okito.
That's awful. I mean, I knew this was coming, but it's still just chilling to think about.
It is. And the way it was done, it was just brutal. Lined up against a tree and shot one by one. And then, in a truly horrific attempt to cover up the crime,
What did they do?
they dug up the bodies, dismembered them, dissolved them in acid, and the bones, they were scattered. It's a gruesome story, a real testament to the ruthlessness of that time.
It's like they wanted to erase Lumumba completely. Not just kill him, but make sure there was no trace of him left.
It does seem that way, and the fact that there was this elaborate cover-up, all these conflicting stories about what happened, well, it raises a lot of questions. It makes you wonder who was really behind all of it.
It seems pretty clear that Lumumba's death wasn't just a random act of violence in the middle of a chaotic situation.
Mm,
This feels deliberate, planned.
it does. And the fact that he ended up in the hands of his enemies, people who had very good reasons to want him dead, well, that can't be a coincidence.
So is it safe to say that Lumumba's assassination was a Cold War crime?
That's the question we're going to try to answer in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at the evidence, we'll unpack the various theories, and we'll see if we can finally get to the bottom of this mystery.
All right, so we left off with this really disturbing image. Lumumba executed, his body dissolved in acid. A pretty clear attempt to cover up a crime.
It was, and the way the news of his death was handled is really suspicious too.
Yeah, they waited weeks to even announce it, right?
Right. And when they finally did, the story was that he had escaped from prison and then been killed by villagers.
Well, come on, that's ridiculous. No one believed that, did they?
Not really, no. But it just goes to show how much effort was going into obscuring the truth, creating this fog of misinformation around what really happened.
So Belgium, we know they were involved in supporting the Katanga secession. Did they ever admit to playing a role in Lumumba's death?
Eventually, yeah. But it took a long time. They initially denied any involvement, but later, much later, they admitted to having a moral responsibility for the events that led to his death. And they even issued a formal apology in 2002.
Moral responsibility. That's a pretty vague term, isn't it? What does it even mean?
It's a way of acknowledging that their actions contributed to the situation that made Lumumba's death possible, like their support for the Katanga secession, allowing him to be transferred there. But they stopped short of saying they were directly involved in the assassination itself.
Okay, so what about the CIA? We know they were discussing assassination plots. Did they ever come clean about their role?
Well, it's complicated. We have declassified documents now that confirm the CIA was deeply involved in Congolese politics, and they definitely saw Lumumba as a threat to Western interests. In fact, they even sent an agent to the Congo with poison-laced toothpaste with the intention of killing Lumumba.
Hold on, poison-laced toothpaste. That's straight out of a spy movie.
It is, isn't it? But the plan was never actually carried out. Something spooked them, or maybe they just decided it was too risky. Either way, the toothpaste assassination never happened.
So if they didn't poison him, what was their role in all of this?
That's the million-dollar question. We may never know for sure. But it's hard to imagine that Lumumba's transfer to Katanga and his subsequent execution happened without at least the tacit approval or maybe even encouragement of the US and Belgium. They might not have pulled the trigger themselves, but they created the conditions that made his death almost inevitable.
And you mentioned Britain earlier. Were they involved too?
There's definitely evidence to suggest that British intelligence might have had a hand in things, primarily because of their interest in protecting mining operations in Katanga. Remember, Katanga was rich in minerals that Britain needed, and they definitely saw Lumumba as a threat to their economic interests.
So we have Belgium, the US, and possibly Britain, all with their own motives for wanting Lumumba out of the picture. It's this tangled web of Cold War politics, secret agendas, and ultimately a really tragic loss of life.
It is, and Lumumba's death had a profound impact. It wasn't just about the loss of one man. It became a turning point in the Congo's history, and it really resonated across Africa and beyond.
He became a symbol, didn't he? A martyr for the Pan-African movement.
He did. Africa's Che Guevara, some people called him. His image, his words, they became a rallying cry for those fighting against colonialism and neo-colonialism.
It's almost like his death amplified his message in a way that he couldn't have done in life.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. His story became a reminder of the human cost of these global power struggles, how easily a newly independent nation can be manipulated and exploited.
It's a reminder that we need to be critical of the information we're given, to question narratives that oversimplify complex events, and to consider the perspectives of those who are often silenced or marginalized. Lumumba's story, as tragic as it is a story that needs to be told and retold, because it still has so much to teach us about power, about justice, and about the ongoing struggle for a more equitable world.
Absolutely. It's a story that challenges us to think deeply about the legacy of colonialism, the complexities of the Cold War, and ultimately what it means to fight for freedom in a world where the stakes are so incredibly high.
Well, this has been a truly eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. It's a story that stays with you.
It does. If you're as fascinated by this story as we are, we've included some links in the show notes to some further reading on Patrice Lumumba and the Congo crisis. Definitely check them out. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep digging for the truth.